I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everyone. We're going to dive right in. We've got a characteristically diverse array of topics for you today. So we're going to start with Rachel, who's going to talk about the deep state, predictably, you might say, being against busting up big tech. We're going to transition to Ben, who's going to give us an update on President Biden's equity affirmative action plan. I'm going to give a segment against a conservatism of quote unquote principled loserdom. And then we're going to go to Emily, who's going to tell us about the doxing horrors with the Washington Post and the libs of TikTok. But let's start with you, Rachel. Tell us about the deep state and big tech.
So as the tech lash, I guess, for lack of a better term, actually takes shape on Capitol Hill, you're seeing big tech flail. Like they never thought it was going to get to this point, right? Where actual legislation would be passing with bipartisan support, which is what we're seeing in both the House and the Senate. So predictably, they've turned to the boogeyman that always arises, if you ever notice, when anyone actually tries to do something meaningful, which is the vague specter of a national security threat. And we're seeing this with regard to how the big tech debate is now being handled. Suddenly, any action toward big tech, if it's a policy change, if it's antitrust enforcement, no matter what, is going to pose a grave national security threat. It is going to let China win, people. If we do anything to curtail or constrain Google or Facebook, China wins. And the latest iteration of this is a handful of former national security officials coming out and saying this, like, a lot of very important throat clearing about, how we know this will happen without, any real evidence of, being able to prove it. They're supposed to just use their national security credentials to make you believe it. But I think, on the whole, the American public is not predisposed to believe it from these people anymore, in particular, because people on this list also said Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. They've also, people on this list, when the Senate was investigating the CIA's torture report, they hacked Senate computers to try and figure out what the Senate had. Like, these are not trustworthy people. And then in addition to that, a handful of people on that list are also literally being paid by Google. So it's how they expect us to take this seriously at this point, I don't know. But it's not just this letter. You're starting to see Google-funded proxies, the nonprofit proxies here in DC, set up, cybersecurity task forces to tell you about all the horrors that will be unleashed if you are forced on your Apple iPhone to sideload apps. If you're allowed to purchase, if you are allowed to decide where to purchase your apps, China wins. I don't know if you were all aware of this, but it's really bad, apparently. Anyway, all of this to say, not only are the messengers absurd here, but the argument is absurd, because these companies, and this, I just feel like I'm repeating things everyone should already know because we've talked about them ad nauseum. These companies want nothing more than to access the Chinese market. They want to be in bed with China so badly that they are willing to, in the case of Apple, assist the Chinese government in developing technology to outpace the United States. There was Google, for instance, as we all know, famously refuses to work with the Department of Defense on artificial intelligence projects. But Google has no problem opening an AI office in Beijing because that's really where they want to be. There was a quote from General Dunford way back in 2019 when he was testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, then at the time as the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when he said, quote, "The work Google is doing in China is indirectly benefiting the Chinese military." He goes on, "Frankly, indirect may not be a full characterization of the way it really is. It is more of a direct benefit to the Chinese military." So to call these our national champions, to say, oh, these are the people that are going to protect us from China, is such an incoherent argument just on its face. And I think it's actually insulting to the members of Congress because the evidence is in such a clear direction that it is just not true at all. It's insulting that we should be led to believe it. But I kind of throw this open to the group. I think there's a couple threads to pull on this, not just the argument itself, but the fact that how are we, do we even take these people seriously, these intelligence officials seriously anymore?
Yeah, I mean, like, what do they think about TikTok? I'd love to know. Like an actual Chinese spy software and information warfare software, basically. But this is, I guess, pretty stunning abuse of their credentials and their power. And in a way that, I actually still think that it's stunning. I don't want to take for granted that it's obvious, after they put their credibility on the line with Hunter Biden, knowing full well that they were covering for a partisan purpose and not for the truth. These are people who, this is like Washington values, right? Like, remember when Ted Cruz decried New York values on a debate stage? This is Washington values in a nutshell. And it is really sickening that this is the state of our sort of elite in our leadership. They're abusing their credentials for profit. And at the loss, at a deep loss to the American public, to American children. It is a farce. It is a lie. Some of them have been convinced to believe it because, when you're blinded by sort of money and prestige and profit, you're easily persuaded by some of these arguments. And some of them don't believe it at all. They just, hate the icky people that are trying to go after the companies that they like and that they work for. The fact that they're on the payroll of these companies is glaringly obvious. Glenn Greenwald, that probably took him like an hour to run this down on his Substack. So it is truly, truly a sorry, sad state of affairs that our elites can abuse their credibility so blatantly, so dishonestly, and they have no fear of retribution, because they're all on the same page. That's how disgusting this is. In a normal, healthy country, you would never put your name on something like this that is so obviously a lie. But they have no fear of doing it because we don't have a culture that holds them accountable.
Well, let me start with a positive of this, which is that I think this letter is an inadvertent admission of the fact that our ruling class has lost the argument on China. They know that everyone knows that China is the greatest adversary that we face, regardless of the hand wringing over Russia, and then, of course, the threat of white supremacy, as we'll get to in the next segment. So to that end, I guess it's a good thing that they're saying, well, we need to be competing with China, because that means they lost the argument about integration and engagement, even though they'll continue to pursue it, of course. And these tech companies, of course, will continue to pursue it. But that said, China wins if we emulate China. And our national security state is in league with the very big tech companies, of course, that they are championing here and protecting. Essentially, they ought to be thought of as adjuncts of a ruling class. They are the corporate communications platforms of the state. They are essential to the state being able to propagate its favored narratives and suppress those that the regime does not like. So consequently, of course, the national security and intelligence apparatus are going to be the ones defending big tech. They're all in league. They all work together. And the Hunter Biden example, of course, perfectly illustrates this sort of seamless relationship between intelligence officials, corporate media, and of course, the big tech communications platforms, where the corporate media's, again, favored narratives, and by extension, the state's favored narratives, are propagated and disseminated, and those that they don't like are suppressed. So I think it's perfectly in keeping with the idea that the big tech world, particularly these companies, are adjuncts of the administrative state. And so, of course, they're going to defend it. And the last thing I'd say is, of course, it's just hilarious that Jim Clapper is the first signatory on it, someone who's perjured himself at least once or twice. It really is it's just a victory all around for a ruling class that continues to beclown itself and destroy its own institutions with its behavior.
So, look, I think it's, to build off what Ben was saying there, I think it's not a coincidence that the man who kind of got the phraseology, this term ruling class, who kind of injected it into the veins of the conservative ecosystem, the late Angelo Codevilla, obviously spent large swaths of his career working in the intelligence community. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He definitely had the intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the entire kind of alphabet soup, all the agencies in mind when he kind of wrote that, that very prescient essay way back in 2010, if I have the year correctly. And, I guess one thing that comes to mind here, I'm happy that Emily brought up, obviously, the Hunter Biden fiasco, which I think was yet another data point of kind of the intelligence community kind of just jumping the shark, kind of like an eyes wide open moment, I think, for a lot of Americans, a lot of kind of right of center Americans who kind of in an earlier generation were kind of told that, to be patriotic, you have to kind of support the CIA the same way that you support the military, things like that. But the point here is that just like woke capital, a lot of these corporations, like here in Florida where I live, obviously Disney being kind of a very much in the news kind of example, the same way that a lot of these corporations are totally kind of exceeding the bounds of what they should be doing as far as kind of looking after the value of their shareholders and the interests of their corporate entity, so is the intelligence community and veterans and current people alike are doing way more than they should be doing as pertains to kind of the narrow confines of their actual jobs. So I kind of draw a direct parallel. If we can coin a term here, I mean, it's not that it's woke capital, it's like woke intelligence, right? I mean, it's kind of the same kind of concept. The technical kind of Latinate legal term for this is ultra vires. In corporate law, ultra vires is when in corporate law, when a corporation is acting well outside of its corporate jurisdictional area. So the intelligence community here is acting kind of ultra vires fashion, is what I would be saying. But it is very much kind of an eyes wide open, it's a sobering moment. So to the extent that it kind of clarifies and hardens the battle lines, I think that's a silver lining at least. But Rachel, any final thoughts from you before we transition here?
No, I think we've covered it. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So Ben, let's go over to you. Tell us about what's going on with President Biden's equity affirmative action.
Yeah, and I think the last segment really actually transitions pretty nicely into this. We have sort of a parallel going on between corporate America, which of course in and of itself is becoming something of an adjunct of the state in many ways, and what's happening in our federal government. And I think I've referenced in the past this first day Biden administration executive order on affirmatively advancing equity. And now, about over a year on from the issuance of that order, it has borne its poisonous fruit. And so the Biden administration recently announced that all of these agencies subjected to that executive order would be releasing their equity action plans. And it notes that more than 90 such federal agencies, including all cabinet level ones, are releasing their first equity action plans, laying out more than 300 concrete strategies and commitments to address the systemic barriers in our nation's policies and programs. So this is, I would call this the remaking of the federal bureaucracy in Ibram X. Kendi's image, period, full stop. It goes on to say, advancing equity is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment that will require sustained leadership and partnership with all communities. And these equity action plans are part of a broader agenda, which also includes implementing the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality, working to ensure the federal government is a model for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the workforce, and on and on. And so I started to review some of these equity action plans from these individual agencies. And what we find here is incredibly striking. So let's start with the Department of Homeland Security, for example. Under its equity action plan, it basically doles out funds to help, quote unquote, counter domestic violent extremism to better address the terrorism related threat to our country, posed, of course, by white supremacists and other domestic terrorists. The State Department's plan calls for improving demographic data collection and analysis to better embed equity and gender equality into U.S. foreign policies. Okay, so we're going to be exporting wokeism now via the State Department. And going back to that DHS action plan, and this dovetails with something I've been arguing here for a long time, their plan notes that the findings, combined with strategic guidance set forth in the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, are being used to prioritize, update, and modify existing goals, objectives, roles, responsibilities, and timelines for all actions across DHS, including those that advance equity. So as I wrote in Newsweek last June, our counterterrorism policy is anti-racism. It is, in effect, applied critical race theory that is our new national security strategy domestically. Going back to the State Department now, worth noting, the State Department touts as an achievement in connection with its equity action plan, increasing intersectionality and equity in foreign affairs through special envoys, encouraging intersectionality across global work streams by engaging in lines of effort to promote racial equity, accessibility, value, and inclusion of individuals from underserved communities. And it talks about engaging with foreign partners on this basis. It also says, the State Department notes, that the analytical framework that I mentioned, this data collection they're going to be engaged in under the guise of equity, will underscore embedding equity into the State Department's foreign affairs work as a strategic national security imperative. So just like on the domestic level, on the foreign level as well, wokeism is our foreign policy. So I can stop right there. We could spend all day going through the various agencies and how this is being applied. Of course, there's a sort of vote buying aspect of this in terms of doling out grants on the basis of equity and federal contracts as well. But I think what's remarkable is, first of all, that I have not heard really anyone in the major media talk about this at all. I have not heard Republican members of Congress, and certainly not Democrats, talk about this at all. And maybe this will kind of dovetail with what Josh is going to talk about. One question would be, what would be the Ron DeSantis approach when presented with a whole of government woke takeover, which we're being presented with here? Why are Republicans silent on this? What should a next Republican Congress potentially do in the face of this plan? And then what will the next president do, maybe in 2024, Republican, knowing that the whole bureaucracy, which of course will try to do everything it can to destroy whoever that Republican would be in the first place. But what will we do when equity has been embedded in every layer of the federal bureaucracy? Those aren't rhetorical questions. I'm curious to hear your all thoughts.
Well, I think we've talked about this theme before, but this just strikes me as such it's symptom of the decadent culture in which we live. The fact that we have the luxury of focusing on things like, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our national security, should tell you so much about kind of where we are as a country. But I think it's interesting because, flipping from my segment where we're like, these national security officials are just making a farcical argument to actual national security concerns, these are having serious effects. I mean, you saw the DOJ cancel, their espionage project around Chinese, academic, Chinese infiltration of our academic institutions because they thought it might be racist, right? You have now Congress trying to pass this bill purportedly to compete with China, and yet all of the research funding is going through the National Science Foundation, making it subject to a host of sort of academic victimology metrics, not actually what's going to actually take on China. So we are intentionally hamstringing ourselves and wrapping ourselves around this axle of wokeness in the face of countries that are just not right, that are laughing their butts off at us because we are just focused on completely the wrong thing. So this needs to be a priority agenda for Republicans when they take over, to sort of rip this out root and branch from the policymaking apparatus, but also, kind of within the bureaucracy. This has to be dealt with in a really strong fashion. I don't know how you do it. If you do it through really strong political appointments, you actually pass statutes, or you do whatever the Curtis Yarvin acronym for this, RAGE, retire all government employees. I don't know how you do it, but this has to be an area of focus.
Well, let me just interject briefly and note that Glenn Greenwald, for example, has argued essentially that the CIA will act like it's promoting wokeism because that serves as a cover for all of the really brutal and nasty things it does around the world. But in this case, I really think, to your point, we see that there are myriad threats that we're facing, and clearly all of these resources are being diverted towards wokeism, and the threats are imperiling us. So I don't actually think that they're engaging in, I'm sure, of course, government does horrible things around the world, as every government does, and good things too. But in this case, I don't think this is a cover. I don't think this is a facade. I think this is really the agenda.
I did a radar on Rising once with the headline, "Is cancel culture literally killing us?" And the online left they had a field day with it and really enjoyed mocking the headline, but it actually was really serious because it was citing reporting from Katie Herzog, who was showing that in the medical community, there were serious consequences. I mean, people not getting treatment, police being taken out of emergency rooms where they have high incident situations because of these ideas. And so Rachel's point about decadence, I think, is an extremely important one here. I really, really think that this is a consequence of our decadence, that our elites sort of use these buzzwords and these debates as their intellectual playthings, while the rest of the country suffers. So it's all superficial and not substantive. And I think you can transfer that right onto just about any institution, whether it's the medical community or the military. And it's the same story. Whatever institution we're talking about, it's the same story, or the sort of baseline of what a government is supposed to be doing for the public, where your tax dollars are going. Paying taxes the other day was like as depressing as it ever has been, just looking around the state of the city that I live in, Washington, D.C. These public services, they can't perform basic functions as a government. And yet we have, a trans policing agency. So anyway, all that's to say, I think is the decadence point is a good one. And I do think we are literally suffering. And I do think some of this is literally killing us in certain situations, specific situations to be sure. But the consequences are dire.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I'll kind of make like a somewhat narrow and more legal point, which was, I was watching, I think I was watching a Trump rally, if not recall, like a few months back or something like that. And he had some line that was, very predictably all the usual talking heads on Twitter and cable news were basically like, oh, he's a fascist, he's a tyrant, he's a dictator. But he basically said that that the imperative is when the next Republican president comes in, that the next Republican president has to have the authority and the ability to quickly and efficiently fire whoever the hell he damn wants to immediately. The problem, obviously, is that there's flawed Supreme Court precedent that currently precludes that. There's some cases going back to the 1930s. There's a case called Humphrey's Executor. There's actually some litigation right now, actually out of Texas, that I'm kind of keeping a rough eye on that could potentially get up to the Supreme Court and challenge from that precedent. When conservatives, when like FedSoc lawyer types talk about unitary executive theory, this is what they're talking about, is the idea that the executive power that Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution speaks, the executive power is vested in a president of the United States. It is not vested in the president of the United States and his cabinet, his political appointees, whatever. The executive power, which literally entails nothing if not hiring and firing and personnel decisions, is in the president. So whoever the next Republican president is, whether it's Trump, whether it's DeSantis, whether it's someone else, we have to recover that ability to actually make quick and efficient personnel decisions. Because if there's one lesson to take away, I think, from the Trump presidency, and Rachel has written a lot about this, is that his agenda was undermined from within by obstinate personnel decisions, a lot of bad hiring decisions too, to be sure, well, a lot of kind of, underhanded deception from within. And then, of course, once they're there, you have a difficulty fire them. So we've got to fix that, whether it's from the Supreme Court, whether it's unilateral action. We have to be able to rectify the executive's ability to make firing decisions that redound to his or her agenda. But let's transition. So I want to talk about here, this is kind of a slightly more abstract, theoretical, less kind of policy news cycle driven segment. I want to talk about a conservatism of, to borrow a phrase from our friend Matthew Peterson of the Claremont Institute and New Founding, a conservatism that opposes quote unquote principled loserdom. So what kind of got me thinking about this week? So earlier this past week, I was up in New Haven. I had two debates at Yale, one for the college kids, one for the law school kids. I did a debate for the college kids through their William F. Buckley program on so-called common good conservatism, which obviously is kind of a vaguely defined term. To me, it's basically synonymous with national conservatism. It's basically getting at the same concept. So I was debating Dan McLaughlin from National Review, who's a very perfectly nice guy, and I don't want to spend too much time picking on Dan individually. We had a perfectly kind of amicable and enjoyable time. But the point here is that what I heard from Dan, and what I think we hear from a lot of kind of conservatism Inc. types, if you will, more broadly, is you hear this refrain over and over again, is that we can't get our hands dirty. We can't get in there. We can't fight. The line that I heard in my debate earlier this week was we have to be the adults in the room. It is incumbent upon conservatives to kind of take the moral high ground, to be the adults in the room, things of that nature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, here's my basic response to that. And I'm writing my column on this right now. My basic response to that is there was a famous Supreme Court decision. I think it was Justice Jackson, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and double check that. But there's a famous Supreme Court decision that says that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. Now, if we take that seriously, then the public square, the town square, the marketplace of ideas, kind of insert your kind of, liberal kind of metaphor du jour, that cannot be a suicide pact either. Okay. I think for 60, 70 years now, really kind of like the post-World War II kind of Cold War era kind of fusionist consensus. I think conservatives really have tried to kind of take a stance of kind of principled neutrality, of trying to say, like, let's not get our hands dirty in the public sphere, because privately speaking, as long as we kind of privately inculcate our virtues, we're going to win out time over time over time. And it's kind of this Whig theory of history kind of hubris, right? This idea that kind of the moral arc of the universe will necessarily kind of bend towards our ideas. The problem, obviously, is that when you unilaterally abandon the public square, when you don't inject your values, when you don't actually try to do something publicly, similar, I think, to what Governor DeSantis is trying to do down here with respect to Disney and things of that nature, then the left is just going to come in. And we've seen the results of that. The results have been this Gramscian march to the institutions, the likes of which we talk about on this podcast basically every week, whether it's big tech, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, the media, the Fortune 500, the K through 12 public education bureaucracy, you name it. So I guess I just fail to see what the alternative is. I mean, I fail to fundamentally see the virtue in a conservatism of principled loserdom that is okay with effectively being controlled opposition, that is okay with nominally fighting its fight, but then just kind of going home at the end of the day and saying, turning over to your wife or husband in bed and saying, you know what? I fought a good fight today, honey, but we lost again. It's okay. I mean, this is what Michael Anton was referring to, obviously, as the Washington Generals, right? And kind of his famous analogy in the Flight 93 election. He was famously saying that Republicans are the Washington Generals who are content to just lose. And I think what we're trying to do on this podcast is suggest an alternative path forward for a conservatism that is not unprincipled, that is maybe just a reshuffling of our priorities, something that Rachel has talked about, but is actually capable of meeting the magnitude of the moment and can actually win. But the point here, and I'll kind of end this rant and just throw it open, because this is kind of a topic we can talk about for hours and hours, is that there is nothing dignified or virtuous about controlled opposition, principled loserdom, with being content to just lose. But I'll kind of just get off my soapbox on that, and curious for everyone's thoughts.
I'll just quickly jump in because Ben and Rachel have a lot of thoughts on this and more policy knowledge. But like, I have never seen these things as sort of being mutually exclusive or incompatible. And that's what's sort of frustrating, right? Because to Josh's point, I remember asking Marsha Blackburn before the Ketanji-Jackson confirmation hearing, if the Kavanaugh hearing really changed the way they were going to approach this. And she was saying Republicans, kind of like the adult in the room argument, it's incumbent on them to be civil, to be examples, blah, blah, blah. And then she went on to be civil and to be an example, but to also sort of hold a post-Kavanaugh hearing for Ketanji Jackson. And that's different, of course, than like the criticisms of DeSantis in Florida. But are we talking about Disney's cronyism and this like public-private partnership that has been based on cronyism and huge amounts of lobbying? And like, is that what we're talking about protecting? So again, I think a reshuffling of priorities is one way to say this, but also just sort of rethinking the limits of where you want to take this sort of free marketeerism, right? Like, is it in the, even going back, as Rachel often does, to Burke or to Friedman, in the way they have always talked about markets and government and freedom. We've just gone far afield of that because, there was a time when booming markets and freedom and everything was, we didn't lose our ability to share consensus on basic facts about life. That's gone now. And so I don't think it requires, throwing conservatism out the window to get it back. I actually don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And I think, the sort of hardline libertarians who do are wrong.
I think Emily's point about like thinking that we are in a consensus situation is important, because a lot of these debates are arising because there are people on the right that still think we're in a country with a shared consensus. We are in a country right now that cannot even agree on biology. We are in a country where some people literally think babies are born and doctors make a guess about their gender. Like that is something that people believe. And like, so the things that formed the basis of the post-Cold War consensus are no longer valid. And so the right has to, as a means of survival, change its approach. And we are living right now, I think, in that sort of very dynamic and tectonic plate shifting environment. Now, I don't think, as Emily pointed out, you have to upend, the whole of conservative thought and conservative tradition. But what you do have to do is A, recognize this, and B, recognize the essence of what we are trying to defend in many cases. Emily brought up the point of Disney. You're seeing people on the right saying, well, we don't want to be the bully. Yes, let's defend Disney's cronyism as somehow protect, the going after them would be regulatory. When in fact, as I've argued many times, this is simply a deprioritization of these companies, of sort of the market interventions that the right has always supported. Maybe don't bail these companies out. Maybe stop giving them, excessive tax breaks. Maybe stop making actually tax breaks the whole of your agenda and begin focusing on something else. And that, I think, when you embrace that approach, you are recognizing where we live. And I think, we talk a lot about woke capital. I think this is especially true with woke capital. You don't have to infuse a regulatory agenda on, whole industries. You just have to make it clear that you aren't going to put up with this, that businesses are not allowed to use their corporate power as a political weapon without receiving results. And you do that enough times, people start to get to learn the lesson, and the market at least starts to revert back to neutrality, which is what we've wanted in the first place.
I'll be brief. I think this goes back to a recurring theme in this show, which is about knowing what time it is and understanding the stakes. So the simple questions that I would pose to people who are on the side of purportedly principled loserdom is, is losing a conservative principle in your view? I think most of them would say losing is not a conservative principle, particularly given who your opposition is, your political opposition. Is seeing your children subjected to tyranny honorable? Is it a conservative principle? I think not. To not put up a fight with equal gusto to what the other side is putting up, and we haven't even begun to muster it, because obviously the left and really the ruling class, and I would call it a uniparty cohort, acts with such impunity on a growing basis that the acts are more and more brazen, to the point where it suggests that they know that they face no penalty for those acts. So we haven't even begun to get really into it. But doesn't not fighting make one complicit in their agenda at the end of the day? I would argue that it does. And the last thing I'll point out is, Barack Obama had that quote about they bring a knife, we bring a gun. And what's funny about that is, in some ways, I think it overestimates who the opposition was that he was referring to there. I would say that for decades, our side has had no knives and the other side has had infinite nuclear weapons. That is how big the chasm is. And so there need to be 1,000 Ron DeSantises blooming around the country. It can't just be a single governor in a single state. It has to be everyone that's engaged. We can do it consistent with our principles. And in fact, it inherently will be consistent with our principle, because conservatism is not about losing in the face of tyranny. It's about combating that tyranny with the same kind of intensity, passion, and focus as the other side, or you are guaranteed to lose. And we will not lose, to Rachel's point, to a country that ultimately shares the same basic values. It will be a country antithetical to itself.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to quickly wrap a bow on this, and then we'll toss it over to Emily for our final segment here. I think Rachel hit the nail on the head when she said that a lot of this conceit, and it really is conceit. I think it's kind of this Whig theory of history conceit that the moral arc of the universe will bend towards conservatism, because conservatism is like the transcendental order and natural and ordained by our creator and so forth. But a lot of this conceit, I think, is predicated on the notion that there is some sort of common consensus that still unites us. It's very difficult to kind of look at the past 5 years, from the riots the day after Trump was inaugurated with the Women's March in January 2017, to obviously the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation, which is like a red pill of all red pills. I mean, to all of the 2020, 16-19 riots. It's very hard to look at that and say that we really share much in the way, if anything, in common anymore. So anyway, let's go to a slightly, I guess in theory it could be a more lighthearted topic, but it's also kind of depressing in and of itself. But Emily, tell us about the doxing with the Washington Post.
Yeah, it's always hard for me to determine whether something is hilarious or depressing now. And I think landing on a combination of both usually fits the bill. Taylor Lorenz had a very online capital V, capital O controversy yesterday, but I think, there are real world consequences of it. We don't need to sort of get into the nuanced media debate about whether libs of TikTok is worth, coverage from the Washington Post. But what I do think is worth talking about is how the Washington Post story, which was written by Taylor Lorenz, this infamous tech reporter who has had stints at all of the prestigious papers from the Atlantic to the New York Times to the Washington Post, was sort of unhappy with the New York Times being overly restrictive of her social media use, which is, let's say, less traditional. She likes to be very personal and intimate on social media, and reports on TikTok trends and youth trends on social media. She set out to basically expose who was behind the Libs of TikTok Twitter account, which has a massive following, and has done better journalism than a whole lot of conservative journalists, but especially mainstream journalists, by basically just going on TikTok and taking what people are publicly saying and putting it onto Twitter, where journalists are, and sort of packaging it in a way that says, here's an extreme thing from a teacher from X school. And it's stunning. I mean, it's teachers saying all kinds of insane things about what they are teaching impressionable children at very young ages about sex and gender and race. They're bragging about it publicly. And here you have an anonymous account just taking what's publicly available and posting it. But it's just that. It's as simple as that. And so Taylor Lorenz set out to sort of uncover who this person is. And I think what's worth talking about is what Matt Taibbi wrote, which is that the story just completely exposes, I think, a huge problem on the left, which is the Washington Post is not the left. Keep that in mind. That's what's even more important about this. This is a purportedly neutral, democracy dies in darkness newspaper. And what they did is basically not even quote the videos. They let Lorenz write up this report. It doesn't even quote the videos of the teachers. It just attacks libs of TikTok with like Media Matters, GLAD talking points, only quotes people on one side of the story, and doesn't even deal with the issue that libs of TikTok is dealing with, which is that this is a very legitimate problem of teachers sort of going rogue, and teaching very, very biased, very incorrect, very dangerous ideological topics to students at a very young age. The story doesn't deal with that at all. And that's what I want to talk about. I had to sort of lay out the context, but to me, that's the most important part of this, is how a huge media institution produces such a one-sided story that attacks a person as a transphobe without even getting into the meat of it. And that's, I think, essentially the left's problem. It's not just the Washington Post problem. It is our political establishment and the liberal movement's problem, the broader sort of progressive movement's problem, is that they do not have a plan to deal with any of what's happening in schools, even though it's bad for them and immoral. They can't even touch it in a neutral report. Like, they didn't even broach what the teachers are actually talking about in this report, because they have zero answer to what is happening in schools. And if they touch it, they're afraid they will get destroyed by the left flank, attacked as a transphobe. They empowered those people, and now they're so terrified to deal with them, they can't even deal with the immoral ideology that is completely prolific throughout the country. They can't even touch it. They have to be dishonest. Even the media has to be dishonest, even though they're like neutral. They can't even do what's just a much more interesting story, much more accurate story, because it's too thorny. And so it's remarkable to me that a story like this gets out the gate, gets past the layers of editors that it needs to, without telling the truth and having any semblance of balance. But it speaks to this problem on the left that they are very ill-equipped to deal with, period.
Well, it's interesting because I think you're right. They don't have a broad plan, but they obviously have some sense of a plan here. And that was obvious in the Washington Post article, which is to conflate a very specific issue of, transgenderism in the classroom, right? The videos that are being posted are very egregious examples of teachers like telling, kids that they can be, whether they're a boy or girl doesn't matter, et cetera, ad nauseum. But their strategy here, which I just think is so unconscionable from a news organization, is to conflate the concern about this very radical trans agenda with how people with homophobia, right? They're trying to say, oh, if you don't like our really fringe belief about gender ideology, then you don't like gay people. When in fact, the two are very distinct, right? But you can see why they want to go down this road, because by and large, the country basically is supportive of gay rights now, right? I think broadly speaking, that's a majority issue. And so they want to take what's a popular issue and say, oh, this is the same, when it's really not. And I think that goes to your point about why they had to eliminate all the context. They didn't quote from any of the videos, because if they did, you would see this isn't actually at all about like gay marriage or like gay instructors in the classroom. This is about a much more insidious discussion of whether biology is real. And I think that was my second issue with this whole thing, is that I don't even think it's who runs the account is newsworthy. What's newsworthy is the fact that the account aggregates publicly available content from teachers who are insane. And the fact that we can't talk about that and we have to instead talk about who's running the account, I think should tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my biggest takeaway from this is, I mean, just to make a very kind of like low hanging fruit level point here. I mean, just the sheer level of hypocrisy of a publication that adopted as its tagline, democracy dies in darkness. Apparently democracy dies in darkness. That includes the need to dox people for just taking clips and exposing them. So I mean, that to me, I just can't wrap my head around that. Look, the doxing thing, I mean, this is so poisonous, this trend. I mean, it really feels like it's kind of picked up steam over the past few years here. Anonymous people, or pseudonymous, I should say, pseudonymous writers, pseudonymous kind of public-facing personalities, speakers, articulators. There's a very long and proud tradition of this in the Anglo-American tradition. I mean, it doesn't take kind of an American history PhD or a constitutional scholar to tell you that. I mean, the writers of the Federalist Papers themselves, obviously, they wrote under Publius. They wrote under kind of a very kind of famous kind of pseudonym. We refer to kind of the Mike Anton Flood 93 election essay. He originally wrote that under a pseudonym. There's just a very long tradition of people doing this. And, in my position personally as Newsweek opinion editor, we are unfortunately unable normally to platform pseuds, but I'm very personally grateful for some, I guess we would say, less mainstream media type outlets like our friends at Claremont's American Mind, who routinely do so, because some of the best content that you find on Twitter and social media these days are from the suits. I mean, it's some of the very, very best accounts that I follow, some of the best hot takes that I see, some of the best kind of rapid fire responses to the, our roiling and fractious news cycle are from pseudonymous accounts whose careers would be endangered if their real identities were exposed. So this is good stuff. I think pseuds are fundamentally, pseudonyms, to kind of not use the shorthand, are fundamentally healthy to a vibrant democracy. And it really, it undermines people to kind of start doing that, obviously, when terrible crap like this happens. Doxing is just, it's evil. It's a really kind of evil, malicious, vindictive act. And, I mean, if there was some sort of legislation that could potentially be devised to kind of punish people who dox others, I would be very amenable to that, honestly.
Well, like Josh, I too side with the pseuds over the suits. So I think that we should roll with that going forward. My kind of takeaway from this story at a high level is, first of all, you have to understand the context here. And Glenn Greenwald and I think Matt Taibbi and others have been exposing this for months. That Taylor Lorenz sort of personifies the cry bully media tattletale who pursues hapless people in American society for political ends, and then claims that their lives are under threats and that they're literally, I think in Lorenz's case, that she faces PTSD for the backlash that she generates by going after these hapless individuals. So the starting point is that this is a bad faith effort coming from a purported journalist who operates in bad faith in a publication that claims democracy dies in darkness, but of course itself operates largely in bad faith, particularly on these kinds of subjects. So that's one point. But a second point is, it is remarkable in some ways, but also not that surprising that this anonymous account, formerly anonymous account, has to be targeted with a Washington Post feature that then explodes on the internet. But what does it say that the fact that one account on social media that literally just curates maybe the most insane on the left, but maybe not. Maybe this is actually just a pretty representative cross section of the left that she's capturing here. What does it say that they need to go after the last anonymous account on Twitter that happens to take footage from leftists and circulate it to the world? But does that, and I go to this question a lot, does this reflect a regime that is incredibly strong and hegemonic, or that is so weak that it literally can't tolerate an account like this? And then not only can't tolerate it, but has to go out and try to destroy this person's life as a threat, to chill anyone else who would dare follow in her footsteps. And the last point I'll make is, it's clear, there was sort of with critical race theory, this thing of, oh, well, critical race theory isn't really a thing, it's just confined to the law schools. And then it's, oh, well, actually, it's outside of the law schools, but you don't really understand what it is. And then, well, it's in schools, but it's actually a good thing. And if you oppose it, then you don't want to teach kids about slavery. And, they continue to shift the goalpost to the end of the universe. And I think here what you see is that on any number of issues, including on the gender/sex related issues, they know that they are incredibly out of touch with where the American people are, that people see this for the madness that it is, and they cannot defend it. So consequently, all they can do is this sort of one-sided straw man, bad faith effort to try and attack those who expose it as bigots, because on the merits, they really can't defend the insanity of the positions. And that's why they hate an account like this, which holds up a mirror to where their own most animated progressive activists stand. The real problem for the left is that what Libs of TikTok exposes is the truth about the left, and they cannot tolerate that because it is poison to their agenda.
So very well said. But let's use that as a transition to final thoughts. Hard to top that, obviously. But anyone have any final thoughts for today's episode?
I can say something optimistic, and I'm glad I beat Rachel to the punch so that I'll set the tone, and she'll have to follow me, which will be really hard. I've been thinking over the past week about the RNC's decision to just not cooperate with the official presidential debate commission, and Elon Musk's sort of flirtation with a hostile takeover of Twitter. And to me, also, you can talk about what Ron DeSantis has been doing that we discussed earlier in the show. To me, this is a good sort of feeling about what it looks like to start having these radical institutional takeovers, or take backs, not takeovers, taking back institutions. And it's going to be a long process. And there's no question about that. And there's no guarantee that it'll be successful. But we do still live in the greatest, country that's ever existed. And we do still have an unprecedented level of sort of freedom within a republic. And it does seem that as long as there's still the will among, people, and people are willing to take bold steps to wield their power, you can really see change. And that's not going to happen overnight, but it's possible that rather than being sort of at the beginning of the decline, we're at the beginning of an adjustment process that actually is successful. And that's not to say we'll ever be able to just sort of wipe our hands clean of all of this corruption and the culture war and look back and say, we fixed it. But it is to say that we may be able to get back to a place, a country that, you're happy to raise your kids in, and you're happy to see your grandkids inherit. And the signs of sort of that institutional movement are there. If you look, they're there. And hopefully, those sort of beget more and more boldness and bravery. And, these are the early dominoes. We'll see, but that's one thing to think about.
Yeah, I actually have we were having a little bit of a hive mind there, but I think there's two things that are really important about this. One is what Ben brought up at the very end there, which is how fragile the left is, how fragile their regime of control is, and sort of tying it into Josh's point about principled loserdom. The right, I think, for a long time has just been taking it, for lack of a better term, right? We just handle it. Like when the left comes after us, we're like, oh, that sucks. And there's been this creeping authoritarianism throughout the country. And I think the right's beginning to push back. But to Ben's point, I don't actually think it's going to take that much to inflict the lesson, right? That you cannot keep punching someone in the face. Eventually they will punch you back. But because the point that Ben made, I think, is valid in that they're so fragile, it's only going to take Elon, not that Elon Musk taking over Twitter is a small thing, but it's only going to take like one, pushback there. It's only going to take a governor like Ron DeSantis stripping Disney of its privilege, or Texas, punishing an airline for doing the same. It's only going to take a few of these really significant examples for people to be like, oh, this has a cost. There is a cost now for kicking the right in the face where there hasn't been before. And if we can get to that point where we just do this a handful of times, I think that is a deterrent effect enough. And so I would ignore these people on the right who counsel, oh, well, the founders wanted us to fight with one hand tied behind our back. No, they didn't. Right? George Washington did not cross the Delaware on a random day. He chose Christmas Eve because he was a badass, right? He didn't withhold here. And I think it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous notion that we should not fight with everything we have to preserve the way of life that has become consistent with America. And I don't think it's going to take very much. It's just going to take waking up in the morning and slashing the machete a couple of times, and we will be in a much better position than we are now.
And let me add to that of course, like the people who the left hates the most are the ones who don't submit to their rule. So this is why, like a Clarence Thomas, for example, they may try to destroy him till the end of time, but he continues to stand up and takes the slings and arrows. And that ought to inspire courage, as I've argued before, in everyone. And so I'll kind of end on an optimistic note as well. I was going to talk about the fact that, the hypothetical, like, does the left sit around and have conversations like this about, well, should we fight with one hand behind our back or just a half a hand behind our back? Like, of course not. It's self-evidently not a part of their modus operandi, because they want to win. They want to dominate. We want to win, but we don't want to dominate other people. We want to live in the country that America ought to be, that it's supposed to be, that was bequeathed to us. But let me just say, so again, from the optimistic side of things, I think that individuals can really have a tremendous impact, both in terms of fighting back and then also in terms of galvanizing a movement and effectuating massive change, maybe more so than ever, given the way that ideas and information can travel today and be amplified, at least, until we end up in a China style system. But like I talked last week about, these kids at the University of Chicago exposing the utter asinine nature of our elites, talking about disinformation. Chris Rufo has been a one-man wrecking machine that has effectuated movements that have had obviously national implications. Elon Musk, of course, richest man in the world. It's not, there aren't exactly many comps for Elon Musk, but another example of one individual who could effectuate potentially a massive earth-shattering change when it comes to the communication of ideas, right down to people on this podcast as well. Individuals can have a substantial impact if they just have moxie, courage, tenacity. They're fearless in the face of an opposition that is oftentimes tyrannical. Again, it can galvanize and inspire others. And it's a hugely target-rich environment. So I think from that perspective, we should all be optimistic, because the opportunity set has never been greater and the stakes have never been greater. And that is a time for Americans to step into the breach and defend their country.
Yeah, so very difficult to follow these very inspiring kind of stump speech style final thoughts. I mean, look, I'll just kind of echo similar sentiments and, say, look, I live here in Florida. It's very hard sometimes in the ecosystem down here not to get kind of like too obsessed with what's happening around you. But I do think the DeSantis versus Disney, I should say Florida, it's not just DeSantis, it is the Florida Republican in particular, Florida GOP's fight versus the Walt Disney Company. I think that it really is a potentially important inflection point here. Because the thing about Florida that, anyone who's paid even like a modicum of attention to American politics over the past 20, 30 years knows, Florida is not Oklahoma. It's not Wyoming. Okay. This is not like a deep red state where Republicans are winning 30, 40 point, landslides every 4 years. Obviously, DeSantis beat Andrew Gillum, who, to put it mildly, was an exceedingly highly flawed candidate. He won by like 40 to 50,000 votes in 2018. I mean, he'll win by a very wide margin this fall. But the point that the governor here and what he's doing in this special, in this special session, he's gonna kind of get past his all signs look like he's going to be able to get past a new congressional maps for Florida that is exceedingly good for Republicans. It looks like we're going to get constitutional carry. Obviously, this fight with Disney to kind of take away their special privileges for their zoning in Orlando in the Kissimmee area. So this really should be an inspiring example. And I think Rachel's right that the fragility of the left's system, their very tenuous hold, their very tenuous grasp on power, the fact that they feel such a compelling imperious need to lash out and censor and dox anonymous accounts like libs of TikTok. If we just have a couple of big examples to really just stand up there and punish our enemies. Yes, punish our enemies within the confines of the rule of law. That is exactly what this is in Florida, literally punishing them within the confines of the rule of law by taking away a special extra legal privilege. Really not a particularly radical measure, by the way. If anything, it probably could be even worse than that. It could be even more than that. But the fact that the left is reacting as they are obviously tells all you need to know. But I think it's a potentially important inflection point. If Florida can do it, there is no excuse whatsoever why all these other red states can do it. South Dakota, Wyoming, all like the deep red states. So I really do hope that a lot of these other red states are looking here to this special legislative session as a potentially important example moving forward. But for this week, we are out of time. So on behalf of Rachel, Ben, and Emily, I'm Josh Hammer. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.